In the wake of the Dark Phoenix saga, the X-Men were once again forever changed. The team was grief-stricken. How can a series recover from an event like that? How can a team recover from an event like that? Where do you even go from there? How do you follow up arguably the most legendary X-Men storyline of all time? For the first time, Cyclops, the leader of the X-Men since day one back in 1963, left the team. While Cyclops, Jean Grey, and Banshee were no longer on the team, Angel subbed in and made his return, and the newly introduced 13-year-old Kitty Pryde made her debut as an X-Man as well. There were once again 6 core members on the team, and this time they were Wolverine, Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Angel, and Kitty Pryde. With their leader now gone, that meant a new leader had to be chosen, and Storm became the new leader of the X-Men. How would the X-Men hold up? We begin this new era of X-Men history with one of my personal favorite X-Men storylines that I've ever read. A storyline you've probably never even heard of, Nightcrawler's Inferno. This was told in X-Men Annual Number 4. Quick side note, so in my last video I didn't mention X-Men Annual Number 3, but X-Men Annuals are extremely important reading, and X-Men Annual Number 3 should have been included in that last reading. And likewise, X-Men Annuals Number 4, 5, and 6 do take place throughout this era. For context, I'm using a combination of a few different reading orders that will be linked down below, as well as a bit of my own intuition. Now, back to the storyline. Oh, this story is awesome. So the basic plot of this story revolves around the X-Men and Doctor Strange teaming up and fighting their way through 7 circles of hell in order to save Nightcrawler. Are you kidding me? That's like the coolest shit ever. I mean, if you don't think that's awesome, I don't know what is. On top of that, we get to learn more about Nightcrawler's backstory and even get some interesting reveals. Wow, what a way to start this new era. After 2 issues involving Alpha Flight, a Canadian superhero team Wolverine was a part of before the X-Men, we finally come to the next most famous X-Men storyline. That's right! I know it's hard to believe, but arguably the 2 most famous X-Men storylines are placed so close together with only a few issues separating them. I mean, Chris Claremont and John Byrne were really on a roll here. Days of Future Past begins unlike any other X-Men story at this point, in an alternate dystopian future 2013. It was the early 80s. Just go with it. In this dark future, mutant kind and superhumans alike have been hunted to near extinction by giant robots created to combat mutants known as Sentinels. Nearly all of the X-Men and other superheroes in the Marvel Universe have been killed, and the select few that remain are largely placed in concentration camps. In a desperate attempt to prevent this dark future from happening, the remaining mutants concoct a plan in which they send Kitty Pryde's consciousness back in time to the present to prevent the assassination of Senator Robert Kelly. Kelly's would-be assassins are the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, led by Mystique, who makes her first appearance in X-Men in this issue. She's not alone in this, as Destiny, Pyro, and Avalanche make their debut here as well. Those 4 and the Blob make up the roster of this new Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Kitty informs the X-Men of what is bound to happen, and they must rush to rescue Senator Kelly from the Brotherhood's assassination attempt. Simultaneously, in the future, the remaining mutants must desperately fight their way through waves of Sentinels against certain death. Despite being only 2 issues long, Days of Future Past manages to be one of the greatest and most important X-Men stories ever told. Its themes of mutant prejudice, Armageddon, and others still remain strong. It showed how, despite all of their powers and abilities, the hope of all mutants and superhumans dangles on a thread, and if those hateful superhumans who use their powers for evil are to succeed, then they are all condemned to death. The story is self-contained, yet its implications remain ever relevant across all X-Men stories. It's a powerful message that still rings true today, not just in the world of X-Men, but in our own world as well. Are we destined to burn in the fires of hatred over our differences? Or can we survive and learn to love one another in spite of what makes us different? These are questions that we have to face every day in the real world, and this kind of social commentary combined with an action-packed time travel dystopian superhero story is exactly what makes Days of Future Past so iconic and awesome. Despite being only 2 issues long, the impact of Days of Future Past cannot be understated. We've seen its themes and plot points echoed again many times, including in the recent House of X and Powers of 10 storyline by Jonathan Hickman. If you want to see Days of Future Past talked about in greater detail, there's a video by Matt Draper that I highly recommend you watch, that I'll link in the description. Tell him I sent you. What's interesting is that Days of Future Past actually came before James Cameron's The Terminator, and I wouldn't be surprised if Cameron was influenced by this storyline. In fact, this isn't the only X-Men storyline from this era that I believe inspired a James Cameron movie, but we'll get to that later. One issue after Days of Future Past ends, John Byrne leaves the book. Dave Cockrum, the artist who started the last era off, would come back and do the art for most issues during this period. As with the first video, I don't want to go too in detail with every storyline in this era. However, I will highlight a few things. First, I want to mention a villain who appeared in the last era who appears again named Arcade. He's a really fun and very underrated villain who makes for some great and fun stories with the X-Men, including one involving Dr. Doom. What I love about Arcade is that he reminds me of classic comic book villains like the Riddler with his wacky trap rooms, antics, and over-the-top gimmicks. He manages to be corny and cheesy while still remaining threatening. He's a kind of classic comic book villain that can work exceptionally well in a number of scenarios when written properly, and I would love to see the character reused more in the future. It's a shame we don't see much of him adapted into other mediums because he deserves to be. Arcade is a great X-Men villain, and in my opinion, one of the best X-Men villains. I mean, not Magneto level, but you get what I'm saying. The next big issue is the iconic double-sized issue number 150, where X-Men fight Magneto once again and Cyclops makes his triumphant return to the X-Men team. This issue is awesome and is very important for a multitude of reasons. One of the most important things about this issue is it gives us Magneto's backstory as a Holocaust survivor for the first time. If you want more on Magneto's backstory, there's a graphic novel called X-Men Magneto Testament that goes in depth with it. It should go without saying, but this graphic novel is very disturbing and depressing. It's also incredibly historically accurate, and it's very evident from the notes that the writers did their research heavily. It's not really an X-Men story, but rather a Holocaust story, and it's worth a read if you're interested. X-Men number 150 is followed by X-Men Annual number 5, which acts as a sequel of sorts to the story in X-Men Annual number 3 and is also a team-up with the Fantastic Four. There is another annual that is important to read around this time, and that is Avengers Annual number 10. Now, you may be wondering why this Avengers issue matters in terms of reading X-Men. Well, that is because it contains the first appearance of Rogue, wherein she absorbs Carol Danvers aka Ms. Marvel's powers. Needless to say, it's important to read to understand the character. We also get the return of the HELLFIRE Club in this era, and a fun standalone story that I just need to mention. There is an entire issue dedicated to a bedtime story Kitty Pryde tells Colossus' younger sister, Illyana Rasputin, in which the X-Men are reimagined as fairy tale characters in a fairy tale setting. I won't spoil any more than that, but just know that it's surprisingly heartfelt. The next point of note is the return of the Starjammers. Cyclops finally learns the truth about Corsair, and if you don't want that spoiled because you still haven't finished the original Phoenix Saga, then you can either go ahead and read that or just stick around because it's not that big of a spoiler. So Corsair is Christopher Summers, Scott and Alex's father long thought dead, who is now leader of a group of space pirates called the Starjammers. The relationship between Cyclops and Corsair is written beautifully by Chris Claremont here in a storyline which also gives us the first appearance of the Brood, who come around in full swing soon after. Alright, before I get to the Brood saga, I want to mention something. X-Men reading is about to get a bit more complicated. In X-Men number 160, directly before the Brood saga, there's an event that triggers a change in a character, Colossus' younger sister, Illyana Rasputin. If you want to read about this in depth right away, then I suggest reading the Magic miniseries. However, it was written a bit later and part of it takes place as such. It simultaneously takes place both before and after everything here. I know, it's confusing. It involves a lot of crazy magic and time travel, so naturally it's weird like that. This brings me to my next point. We are finally introduced to the New Mutants in this era. The issue here is that the New Mutants are technically a separate team and a separate series from the X-Men. But most big X-Men fans I've talked to and learned from online agree that you should read Chris Claremont's New Mutants comics as part of his X-Men run. So that's what I'll be doing. Now, where to start? To finish off this era of X-Men history, we have the Brood Saga and the introduction of the New Mutants. What's cool about this is that both of these storylines take place at the same time, and as a result they actually tie together pretty nicely in the end, and they create a great end for this era of X-Men and a great springboard for the next era of X-Men history. So without further ado, let me break it down for you. The Brood Saga begins in Uncanny X-Men issue 161. Remember how I mentioned there was another X-Men storyline in this era that I believe inspired an 80s James Cameron movie? Yeah, this is it. To anyone who has seen Alien and Aliens, the Brood will look somewhat similar. I don't want to go into too many details, but the Brood were very clearly modeled after the Xenomorph in Ridley Scott's original 1979 film, Alien, in more ways than one, which you'll see when you read. However, the Brood Saga came out in 1983, before the film's equally iconic sequel, Aliens, was released in 1986. That leads me to believe that many of the traits about the Brood, such as them operating like a hive with a queen, were influential in James Cameron's film, Aliens. So essentially, combine X-Men and Aliens and you've got the Brood Saga. I don't know about you guys, but that sounds awesome to me. This story mixes sci-fi, action, and horror elements in a way that is totally unique. There is a feeling of dread that comes with the threat of impending doom and the dangers that lurk around every corner throughout this entire storyline. Wolverine is an absolute badass here, and he's not the only one with moments to shine, but I'll leave that for you to discover in your reading. This is actually the first and only time I was able to read an issue of the Uncanny X-Men in its original printing, thanks to my uncle who gave me a bunch of his old comics. Issue number 166 is what is supposed to be the double-sized finale of the Brood Saga, and it both is and isn't. Kind of like with the Dark Phoenix Saga in the last era, there is an issue that follows that truly wraps it up and simultaneously concludes this era of X-Men while still setting up the next one. But wait, let's rewind a bit before we get there. The Brood Saga actually takes place in space, and with the X-Men on a deep space adventure, that left Professor X home alone on Earth to recruit 5 new mutants. Get it? New Mutants? This takes place in Marvel graphic novel number 4, entitled The New Mutants, written by Chris Claremont with beautiful art by Bob McLeod. These 5 new mutants are Karma, aka Sean Coy-Man, sorry if I butchered that, Wolfsbane, aka Rain Sinclair, Psyche, aka Danielle Moonstar, who will later be called Mirage, Cannonball, aka Sam Guthrie, and Sunspot, aka Robert DaCosta. These characters are great. They all have somewhat tragic pasts and they're all unique in one way or another. This graphic novel does a great job of introducing them. After that, read New Mutants issues 1 through 3. Issue 3 ends mere moments before Uncanny X-Men number 167 begins, where the X-Men and the New Mutants meet for the first time, and the cliffhanger at the end of Uncanny X-Men number 166 is finally resolved, bringing both the Brood Saga and this era of X-Men to an end. Now, with both the X-Men and the New Mutants living under one roof, what kind of stories await us in the future?